Chapter 29. All her born years. God buy me for a penny. Old saying. Chauncey didn't believe it when they told him. Of course he knew that news traveled fast in Americus. More than once, when his mother served him breakfast, she had told him something that had happened since he had gone to bed the night before, but this Saturday morning she said nothing, only gazed at him with her tight mouth and the cruel look in her eyes that he had seen so often. He knew what it meant, or thought he did. Her bitterness over what had happened in front of everybody at the fairgrounds yesterday, that he and Rosa had brought out into the open the ugly thing about his father that had been buried so long. What his mother didn't know, nor would he tell her, was how little he had to do with it. The whole thing had just happened to him. He had gone alone and unsuspecting into the basket. It was really Rosa who was responsible and to blame. All the way to the Sentinel office, he went over the incident in his mind, checking it step by step, and it only proved his contention. Even though he could never come out and say so, Mr. Lane looked up at him searchingly when he came in. A tall, spare man. His hair hung down behind his ears, and a stained black stock crossed around his stand-up collar. His thin face was mostly bone. The forehead seamed with parallel lines, his mouth wide and his eyes sunken pits, like the eyes of a man who had died and which still followed you about from his portrait hung on the courthouse wall. He seemed to be writing unusually savagely this morning. Chauncey thought his fingers holding a very thick pencil, the whole arm moving from elbow to fingers, making sharp dots and dashes. When done, he held the long foolscap sheet up to read, but he turned and spoke to Chauncey instead. "You want me to write the news column today?" "Why, no, sir." Chauncey felt surprised. The deep eyes did not spare him. "You've heard the news." "I don't know what news you mean, sir." The fierceness on the editor's face dissolved, leaving his head like a kind of skull. "Well, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you. Your little friend, the Tench girl, died last night. She took her own life. They found the body this morning." That was when, for the moment, Chauncey couldn't believe it. Rosa dead, and by her own hand. It couldn't possibly be, and yet inside of him he felt all his blame against her collapse suddenly, like a house of cards. Mr. Lane's face was inscrutable. For a time he held it stiff and grave, as if this was a moment of importance, of dignity to the dead. Or perhaps he couldn't find the exact words he wanted to say. He went on finally. "We can say nothing of that in the paper, of course. Merely state that the deceased met her death at her mother's home early this morning, exact time unknown. Everybody knows about it anyway. I understand the whole town is shocked by the details." Chauncey stood there rigid and confused. What were these shocking details? Part of him cried out to know, but the rest of him closed its ears and would hear nothing. He felt Mr. Lane's eyes search him, but whether with pity or scorn, he had no means of telling. It would have been better, he knew afterward, to have had the whole story than instead of filling his mind with horror and uncertainty of the unknown. He tried to prepare himself by fearing the worst, but it turned out to be so much worse than he had dreamed. He couldn't escape it anyway. Everywhere he went that day he heard snatches of the cruel talk and exclamations. "You'd reckon she'd throw herself in the canal, wouldn't you, sooner than make such a mess? It was an old eel-spear head she done it with. They said it was honed sharp as a razor." That was something to see, for fair, the blood dripping down through the loft boards. It turned my stomach. I couldn't eat a bite of dinner. She done it after she went to bed, and was that quiet, nobody in the house heard a blessed thing. If it wasn't true what they said about her, what did she ever do it for? Folks don't make way with themselves without a reason. That old witch, do you reckon she'll go out of the house now to the funeral? Didn't you think it queer, the blood dripping down on her own mother? You suppose she done it on purpose like that? Anyway, it gave me the creeps when I started to think about it. Dr. Keller said she was all cut up. He didn't see how a body could cut their own self that way. He said it looked exactly like she thought she had something wrong inside of her and was a-trying to cut it out. But he couldn't find a thing the matter with her. All the time Chauncey went about his work, while he set down the facts that Miss Martha Fuller and Mr. Mayhew Jones were united in holy matrimony in the First Methodist Church, or while he wrote an advertisement for Mr. Wells, the storekeeper. Don't mind loud cries of others, but call and you shall see more new goods and cheaper still. Grandules and fashionable bonnet trimmings at the Enterprise on Water Street. The ugly words about Rosa were the ones he kept writing over and over in his mind. Now he felt sickened by his own treatment of her at the farmhouse. Could that have been only evening before last? Something inside of him struggled and fought to reach across that short space of time, trying to get back to Rosa still alive, when he could make everything all right. Even then he remembered that through his sullenness Rosa had stayed her own gentle self. It must have dashed her hopes to the ground to have to go back to Americus, to her mother and their shabby house on Dock Street, and yet she had been the one who had tried to cheer him. He remembered now the strange thing she had told him that evening, but then Rosa was always telling him strange things. He was not to worry too much, she said, about her not getting away from Americus. Now that she had seen him again, she would be all right, and she could always get away to her secret places. He knew what those words meant. One of her secret places was the canal. More than once, as they walked the tow-path or stood on the bridge, especially on a clear day, she had pointed to the world of reflection in the water. At first it looks upside down, she had said, but if you look at it long enough, it changes around, and our world up here is the one that's upside down. See the sky down there? It's just like the sky up here, but isn't it lighter and softer and a more beautiful blue? And the trees and grass, everything's so peaceful and free down there. When I go down in it, I feel I'm getting back to a wonderful place, I know. It's just your imagination, he had told her. You can never really go down there. Oh, yes, I can, she had said. Not with your body, with my body, she had insisted. I can move my arms like I'm swimming and float right over those trees. It's impossible, he had told her sharply. If your body went down there, you'd get wet and drown. That had stopped her for a moment, and her face went grave. If I don't go down with this body, she had said slowly, then I must go down with some other body that's just as good as this one. It had made him angry at the time, but now it only gave him pity, like the pity you feel for a child, while recurrent tingles ran along his spine. He cursed his own stupidity. If he hadn't been sullen and blind the other evening, he might have known of what dark things she was thinking. Tonight, as he tramped the dark streets, everything that Rosa ever said or did came up in his mind, things she would never say or do again. He could see her lying slight and still in that little dark house, dressed in her green or brown silk, while rough hands sopped her white face and her small folded hands with baking soda water. That night he scarcely closed his eyes, and in the morning nothing could have kept him from her burial. Oh, never would he have dared to go to it directly. By a devious route he went to the waterfront and stood around the corner from the Wizard of the Dell's cabin. There he waited till he saw the 6 young women in white dresses come out of the front door of the saloon. They were bearing the unpainted diamond-shaped coffin to the basin delivery wagon. Cold and sweating, Chauncey watched the stream of mourners follow. Everybody, he thought, was there. Everybody but her real father and her Wheeler half-brothers and sisters. In life they had ignored her, and in death deserted her. Of all that side of the family only himself attended, and that by stealth, sneaking cowardly as he had in her lifetime. What rats these Wheelers were, he told himself, as moving by different streets, he followed the funeral down along the canal, across to the river, and the little old cemetery they called the Devil's Acre. Here a jockey had been buried, a gambler, some bad women, a few Negroes, several men and women who had been hung, or who had hung or drowned themselves, or had otherwise placed themselves beyond the pale. Among them Rosa had to lie. Had it been out in the country, he might have forgiven it, but here the shabby fringes of the city had grown around it, shutting it in. Coarse, uncut river grass covered it, hiding the sunken graves and the few board markers, most of them flat and rotting on the ground. Chauncey thought he had never seen such a pitiful sight as that group of mourners and white pallbearers standing for a few minutes in grieved attention before leaving Rosa to her desolation. From time to time the words of the preacher, some of whose beliefs had only horrified Rosa, drifted across in the cold wind. Later Chauncey could see yellow clay flung into the air. Not until all had gone, preacher-singers, pallbearers, mourners, the tag-end and curious, Ed Malcolm's delivery wagon, and finally the grave diggers themselves, their shovels on their shoulders, did Chauncey go over and stand close by that bleeding mound of earth. Only then he realized that he hadn't even brought flowers. At the thought of her lying down there in the wet ground, with the desolate scene above, and the bleakness of winter coming on, such a feeling went over him that he didn't believe he could endure it. It must pass, he told himself, for time heals all things, but day after day it never did. When he woke in the night, it was there. What he would have done without his work at the Sentinel, he never knew. He seldom read in print what he wrote or remembered it afterward, but it was something to hold on to and lose himself in. He was aware of Mr. Lane's eye on him when he answered strangely, and of the silent watchers at home when he came stumbling in, but none of them spoke to him about what lay like lead in his breast. None but his mother, and he shut his ears to her as if he hadn't heard, and climbed the stairs to his room. One of them must have spoken to someone else, for Dr. Shortwell, the family minister, sent Chauncey word that he wanted to see him. Half unwillingly, half in faint secret hope, he went across the square. There had been a church standing on the corner ever since he could remember. When he was a little fellow, it had been frame, and before that, something else. Now it was of brick. The biggest church in the city, and with the greatest congregation, a huge structure with wide steps running up to a portico, with 3 front doors topped by carved fan lights, and 4 huge white fluted pillars. There were 2 rows of white windows all around, one upstairs and one down, and the white steeple went up so far that God help the people around here if it ever blew down. From its belfry on a clear day you could see Tateville, and once when the wind was right, it was claimed they heard the bell out there, although many doubted. Anyhow, it was a long way from the first little log church that had stood there, not much bigger than a cabin, his mother said. The maid took him in, and Dr. Shotwell met him at the door of his study, a tall, dour-looking preacher with iron-gray hair curling up defiantly on the top of his head. His low collar showed the strong sinews of his neck. The black tie had been furled with carelessness and melancholy. His face was gentle and forgiving, and yet the heavy eyebrows told that on principles he was uncompromising. He talked to Chauncey a long time about his poems and newspaper writing. Then he took him down and outside, where he produced a heavy key and unlocked the church door. "Come in, my lad," he said with a fierce tenderness. "I want you to bare your head in your own church. It's been a long time since you were here, and that's a reproach to your Maker. Your family is responsible for this church in the first place. Your mother gave the land. Your grandmother lies, the first silent inhabitant of the churchyard. Your brother heads the council, a fine man, and our next governor, everybody says. your sisters and their families attend. It would make us all very happy if you could see the light and come too. We have missed you, but whether you realize it or not, my lad, you have missed us too, and the peace and blessedness of giving up sin and the world. He said a great deal more than that. Chauncey listened hungrily, wretchedly, bracing himself against any possible mention of Rosa's name, and yet all the while secretly thirsting for some word of charity for her that would lighten the leaden weight in his breast. But nothing rose to the good doctor's lips save piety and justice and the uncompromising word of God. When Chauncey left, all that persisted in his mind was the bitter thought that his sister Sully could rest in peace in the sacred ground of Dr. Shotwell's churchyard, but her half-sister Rosa must lie like an outcast in desolate and unhallowed ground. Chauncey never went back to his mother's church, but sometimes he would slip into yellow-painted St. Martin's on Willow Street. Not that Father Murtry of St. Martin's ever sent for Chauncey, even to have a sermon printed in the paper. Tense and still the boy would sit there in the strange-smelling dimness, hoping to find a moment of peace. St. Martin's was not so large as his mother's church, but no one had to unlock the door for him to enter. Nor on a weekday was it empty and deserted. The yellow flames of candles billowed in the dimness, and the red of the sanctuary lamp glowed like a coal in the cold. Seldom did he sit long that others did not come to kneel at pews or altar or to make their round of the stations. The boy liked especially when he saw the white habit of St. Dominic nuns in the dark church, and thought he could feel then how those white-clad forms must have looked coming through the dark forest to early Catholic settlers like the MacMahons, who his mother had said had cried for joy at the sight. When Father Murtry saw Chauncey, he stopped and spoke to him. He liked to tell about Father Guntz, who had founded the mission. I think your father and mother knew him, he would say, though seldom would he go so far as concede that the early priest had been nursed by the boy's mother once during a bad spell of wood fever. It was just that he didn't like to admit the saintly priest's debt to someone not of the faith, Chauncey thought. Ever he gave Chauncey the feeling of strength and secret martyrdom, of vast authority behind him, and of the church's closely guarded treasure of security and peace. If only the boy thought he could break into the papal fortress and take some of that peace for his own without giving his soul in exchange. Any word of cheer or reassurance for Rosa from Father Murtry's lips would have carried the weight of centuries with Chauncey. The boy's gaze hung wretchedly on the lips of the priest and on the signs of his office, hoping that he might recognize in his eyes the nature of his illness and cure it. Just a sentence of forgiveness for Rosa would do it. He must have known about her, Chauncey thought, and his silence could only mean that the matter of lost souls was inexorably fixed, and discussion futile forever. His own mother and father were the last Chauncey would have thought to go to for sympathy. Even should he die, all he would expect his mother to say was, "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." But one Sunday when Sooth and Libby and their families had been invited home to dinner, an untoward thing happened. They were sitting around the table talking of Dr. Shotwell's sermon. It must have been a powerful one, for Sooth kept referring to it uneasily until Chauncey's mother took a firm hand. "Now that's enough about hell," she said. "I never was there, I don't look to go there, and so long as we lead a decent life, none of us need to. Not even Papa," Sooth faltered. A grave silence ran around the table. "I think you have a better father than you have any idea of, Sooth," her mother said, calm as could be, and with a still calmer look at Chauncey's father. You could see that Deasia wasn't satisfied. "Well, I know one that's not so far from us, that's burning in hell right now," she came out with, which was as far as she dared say. As her meaning fell over Chauncey, he pushed back his chair and hastily left the table. After perhaps a half-hour there was a knock on his door. "Papa wants to see you," Massey called. Chauncey waited as long as he dared. He smelled his father's cigar before he got there. His father had drawn on his long coat with the black satin collar, and now stood in the hall waiting for him. "Put on your hat and come along, Chauncey," he ordered. "I want to talk to you a little." Of late years this was the last thing Chauncey wanted. There was no surer way to feel himself shrink to little or nothing than to walk out on the street beside his imposing father. The boy ever tried to avoid speaking to certain persons in this part of town, but his father greeted fearlessly everyone they passed. Sometimes his word was brief, sometimes cordial, sometimes severe, sometimes genial, but always with dignity and power. Today he turned in at the silent courthouse, and Chauncey followed. The empty stairs and stale halls rang with their footsteps. Upstairs his father unlocked the door to his office. What was coming, Chauncey wondered. His father did not take off his hat, but seated himself in his immense red leather chair. "I want to have a little talk with you, my boy." He shook the ashes from his cigar to the bare floor, as if to set an example to the boy not to take things too seriously. He went on, not unkindly. "I've been watching you for some time, Chauncey. You are too much like Sooth. You let things depress and upset you. Take, for instance, the remark Deasia made at the table. Mark you this, my boy. There's nobody burning in hell right now. That is, nobody who has departed this life. The living may suffer, but the dead are free, despite what your mother's church tells her. She and I and you and all whom we know in Americus today will some day be only unthinking and unfeeling clods whirling on this dead planet. There was no heretofore to worry about, and there is no hereafter." He looked at the boy with beneficence, but instead of a feeling of relief, one of tragedy and horror sickened Chauncey. His father went on, "I want to give you a measure of counsel. Don't give credence to everything you hear. There are 1,000 conflicting religious beliefs. Reason should tell you that they can't all be true. If you are wise, you won't let yourself be deceived by any man-made theories of God. Formulate your own philosophy as you find it. Make that your religion. If your logic is sound, no one can hurt you, and you will never attempt the dangerous and impossible. I mean, trying to right the mistakes of the dead. Justice must be shown during life. It cannot be administered to those who are gone. That's why I brought you in here today. I want you to have a glimpse of my religion." Chauncey stared. His father sat there noble and untouched. If he felt any shade of remorse or regret for the tragedy he had fathered and remained indifferent to all his life, he admirably concealed it. Rising, he led the boy through his private entrance to the court. The large white assembly room lay silent and peaceful. Golden October sunlight streamed through the long ecclesiastic-like windows and over the empty benches that might have been pews. "This is my church," his father said with feeling, "and these are my altar and pulpit." His hand indicated the platform and the raised white bar with the tall, solemn bench, like pulpit chairs behind it. "Here we dispense no superstitious punishment and reward for the dead, but practical justice to the living. Over there is our Amen corner, the honest seats of the jurors drawn from the people. This is our witness box, and we admit no visions, but the straightforward testimony of competent men and women. The prisoner's dock I call our judgment seat. Here the penitent or unrepentant sinner must have his innocence or guilt proved in the presence of living witnesses, and a congregation drawn from the entire county. It's very much of a religious service to me. Like my friends, the Catholics, I like to come to my church. Sometimes, when no service is being held, I sit here in the peace and quiet and meditate on the justice meted out in this and similar institutions all over the world, dedicated not to some unknown God, but to man." He stopped. It was plain from his voice that he was greatly moved, but Chauncey felt no tingle of contagion. Only a bleakness and numbness came over him, as if he had been shown a vast world of desert and rock in which no spark of hope or life might flourish or be born. Was there no balm in Gilead then? The boy cried to himself. No rhyme or reason in living, no solace for the cheated and deprived dead. Not until winter did Chauncey dare to go back to Welsh Valley. Had it been summer or early fall, he felt he could never have endured the warm sunshine, the trees still in leaf, the fields in their growth that he and Rosa had seen together. But now the warmth had vanished, the sun thinned, even the corn gone from the fields, the grass dead, the once green leaves withered and fallen. He took a satisfaction seeing it so, to pass under trees bare and frozen, to tramp on the lifeless leaves and grasses. If Rosa was dead, then it was right that so much of what she loved was dead too. But the Griffins he found more alive than ever, their house laid about snugly with corn shocks. At his step they came to the door, like bright-eyed woodchucks to the mouth of their burrow, but their cries of welcome at the sight of him soon turned to gravity as they took him to the warm kitchen. He had feared to explain why Rosa was not along, but even here in Welsh Valley they knew all about it, and, like true country folk, did not try to hide or gloss over the way she had died. Wasn't it a pity? Who would have reckoned that was the last we'd see her? You never know who'll be next. Why couldn't it have been one of us old ones? Why did it have to be her? What got into her? We always said we never knowed anybody happier than she was. She wouldn't have had to done it, would she? No, because if it had anything wrong with her, she could have come out and lived with us. Yes, we'd have took care of her and everything that came along. At their honest declaration of friendship and bounty, something which for weeks had been frozen in Chauncey melted like icicles in the sun. There was nothing wrong, he told them with feeling. We didn't think there was, the middle one said quickly. Not with her kind, but she could have stayed here just the same. Yes, we have plenty of room. It might as well have been her as old Johnny. You know, he always comes with us for the winter, but he had lots of other friends he could go to. As they spoke, old Johnny himself came out into the kitchen. Chauncey looked at him with interest. So this was the man his mother used to talk so warmly about. Why, he was just a simple old man, thin as a rail, and dressed in bulging ragged clothes. His patched linsey shirt, open at the neck, showed a coarse coffee sack he must have slipped over his head for an undershirt. His waist and seat bulged as if with 2 or 3 pairs of pantaloons, one on top of the other. He shook off his shoes in the kitchen and padded around the floor in his bare feet. This here's our friend we told you about, the oldest Griffin said. You know his true love's dead. She done away with herself. Old Johnny turned quickly at that, and his eyes had a strange brightness in his witless face. She's not dead, he cried in his peculiar voice. We're the ones who sleep. She's awake now to glory unknown and in a body unchanged. She's in the new life. Today thou shalt be with me in paradise. The Son of David and the Lamb and Prince of Peace didn't say on resurrection morn. No, today she lives in Beulah land. Hallelujah! Give glory to the Lamb. Oh, that man would praise the Lord for his wonderful goodness to the children of men. Chauncey was too astonished to say anything. Old Johnny went on with fanatic zest. We were never born, my lad, and we never die. Before Abraham I was. The sun sinks, but it shines on another land. Love never dies. If she loved you then, she loves you now. Emmanuel saw the true vision. He laid eyes on those who had died, and they were not in their graves. Praise the Lord. Emmanuel saw the blind see, the lame run, and the miserable happy. And I will restore unto thee the year that the locust hath eaten. O death, where is thy victory? O grave, where is thy sting? Graves are empty, my lad. The dead are not there. Their joy is the happiness of the Lord. If they loved the good and beautiful here, they love it there. Call nobody damned, for the one the world calls damned may be the one the Lord loveth best. Judge not that ye be not judged. We are all pilgrims on our way to heaven, and there our true selves will be known. Praise the Lord. His unshaven face and dirty gray mane, his simple look, and the wild gleam in his eye unsettled Chauncey. The smell from his unwashed body repelled him. He tried to move away, but the grotesquely clothed figure saw his advantage and pressed closer, so that his breath and spittle nearly overwhelmed the boy. In the end, Chauncey left before he had intended, declining all invitations to stay. take along some pearls of truth," old Johnny cried. His bare feet padded upstairs, and when he returned, he carried a book in his hands. Chauncey thought he meant to give it to him, but he only tore off some pages, as if to start a fire, and pressed them into his hands. "Read and be free. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord." When the boy got outside, he found the pages weren't from the Bible at all, but from Heaven and Hell by Emanuel Swedenborg. So that was Johnny Appleseed and his holy book, Chauncey thought with distaste, and yet as he went down the lane and crossed the bridge to the road, he thought he felt a little better. At least now he could endure looking on the loveliness of Rosa's beloved Welsh Creek, which he couldn't when he came up. Certain sayings of the strange old man kept coming back to him, especially what he said about Rosa not being dead but living, that if she loved the good and beautiful here, she loved it there, and that the one the world called damned might be the one the Lord loved best. Why, he wondered, did the philosophy of life that most eased and satisfied him have to come from a ragged, unwashed old beggar? Why was it, if such things were true, they couldn't have been spoken by Dr. Shotwell or Father Murtry, or by his father, or some other scholar of dignity and respect? Then he might have been able to receive and accept them. As it was, who could believe a fanatic voice, crying in the wilderness, a lowly, unlearned wanderer who lived on the charity of the humble and the poor? By the time he reached the canal, a growing skepticism of the whole business had come over him, a sense of anger against his father and mother, against preachers and priests, philosophers and pioneers, and all the rest who saw any good in the unjust and meaningless torment of life. Chapter 30. Sayward Feels the Earth Turn. I propose to alter that old phrase, a speaking aristocracy in the face of a silent democracy. I am democratic, and I am certainly not silent. Chauncey Wheeler. It struck Sayward all of a heap the day Chauncey told her he was leaving home. Oh, she couldn't help noticing the bitter looks he had been giving them the last few months, but she hadn't looked for this. "Can I ask, Chauncey, where you are going?" she said humbly, and saw him set his lip. "I'm of age now and intend to board with a family on 7th Street, he told her. "You mean you are staying right here in Americus?" was what came up in her mouth to cry out, but all she said was, "You got a home here, Chauncey. You don't need to pay board. We hoped you'd stay with us a long time yet." His thin face only hardened. "I've let you support me too long now. It's time I broke away and stood on my own feet, and felt free to say the things I ought to say." "You can say anything you want to now, Chauncey. Not against you and Papa and what you stand for. Not when I sleep in your house and eat from your table." "What don't you like about us that we stand for?" his mother asked him. He threw her a look and met hers full on. She thought for a minute he was going to light into her for fair. Old-time people would never understand, was all he would tell her. When Deesia came home and heard about it, she said Chauncey was just plain spoiled and ungrateful, but Massey said it must be the new society Chauncey had joined. You know that woman from Connecticut and Charlie Hollenbeck are in it. They call it, I think, the American Peace Society. It's all over the country. They're cracked on peace and don't believe in doing anything that might make friction. They say all this talk about freeing the slaves is criminal because it makes bad feeling between the North and the South. They claim Papa is a war maker because he's such a strong abolitionist, and you're the same, Mama, because you helped all those darkies get away, especially the time you stood off the sheriff from Kentucky and gave my pink dress to that black wench in the cellar. Porteous saw it a little differently. These societies are nothing to get agitated over, he said magnanimously. I've watched Chauncey for a long time, and I might say some of the other young people too. I see all this chiefly as a revolt of the young against the old. It has always been, and I suppose will always be. The young, not all of them, but the weaker members, are easily bruised by the hardship of the world. They can't endure it, and think it shouldn't be. Not having the experience of the old, they imagine they can form a society and do away with it. Perhaps, he added gravely, they can. We should let Chauncey go and see what he and his kind can do. Perhaps they can move this dark old earth a little nearer to the sun. Certainly, if they could wipe hardship from the face of the earth, they would be the greatest saviors of mankind. At his last sentence, Sayward felt her face grow bleak. She didn't trail along with Porteous on that. Take away all the hardship from the world, and man wouldn't amount to much, she opined. He'd just lay back and grow fat and feeble as a pug on a lap. Not that she wanted to start an argument with Porteous. They had wrestled the subject too often before. She didn't want to see a war start in this country either, but sometimes you had to stand up for your rights or lose them, and you couldn't stand up sitting down. It went hard enough for her to sit down and let that peace society drive Chauncey from home, make him give up that nice room of his on the corner, and 3 meals a day she took pleasure cooking for him. But she said nothing, though it gave her a bad turn. The others, save Gordon, she hadn't minded going. They had taken care of themselves in the past, and there was no reason to fret they couldn't do as much in the future. But Chauncey was her baby. She'd had to nurse and pray him into growing up. Now that he was grown, he had got it into his head to leave, and no thanks to her or Porteous. Well, she didn't know as she looked for any, but neither had she looked for it to be like this when he went. But who would have reckoned any likeness between Chauncey and Wyatt? Why, Chauncey took to books and learning, like a duck to water, while her brother Wyatt could hardly write his own name, and yet when they got to be their own men, nobody could hold either one. Could Wyatt wait till he got off by himself? No. Could he be satisfied eating her rations, and sleeping where she knew he was safe and sound? Not him. And now her youngest and puniest, the last she could ever give birth to, was a following him. Chauncey went on a winter's day, when the snow lay deep in the street, and the cold blew down from the English lakes, so that she had to worry all night did he have enough covers where he was at to keep him warm. Most every day she looked out the window on the chance she might see his thin face and shoulders coming back across the square. He might have forgot one of his traps, she thought, or got hungry for a taste of her pigeon pie, or what he called blubbub ever since he was a little feller. A couple pieces of toast swimming around in a dish of hot milk. And butter, or he might have wanted to see again the house where he was raised, to climb the stairs one more time to his old room that she kept just like he left it. Porteous mentioned seeing him in the courthouse, and the others dropped word of running into him here and yonder, but although often during the day she would catch herself stopping to listen, it was a long time till she heard his familiar step at the door. She thought surely he'd drop in sometimes for dinner or supper. Twice she had Deesia stop at the Sentinel and bid him home for Sunday dinner, when the family would be there. The first time he sent word back that he couldn't make it on account of something else. The next time Deesia said he wasn't there any more. He'd had trouble with Mr. Lane over something he'd written. So he quit last Saturday and went to Cincinnati, where they said he was going to be editor of the new Palladium and the youngest editor in Ohio. It's that Peace Society woman, Deesia said. She bought the paper and made Chauncey editor. She's 10 years older than him if she's a day. Leave it to him always to be taken in by some woman. It was just talk about this woman, Sayward told herself. Perhaps Deesia made it up. She and Chauncey never got along together anyhow, not even when they were little. But if it was true, at least Chauncey was an editor. Now don't go feeling so proud over him, she told herself. She had Porteous send money for the paper, and there it was, the new Palladium. 2 long sheets printed both sides, and Chauncey's name down as editor. She'd have known it even if his name wasn't there. The minute she started reading, she could hear Chauncey's voice speaking the words in her mind. Friday evenings, when she laid down the paper, she could hardly believe that he hadn't been sitting here talking to her, and had now just gone up to his room. So strong and clear the impression of him remained. Oh, there were some things in the paper that gave her a turn until she got used to them, especially the editorials, which she spelled clean through. She used to ponder over the paper's motto, printed with a rearing horse on either end. Liberty, equality, and peace, it said, but Sayward found a lot more in the paper about equality and peace than about liberty. Most everybody who had made something out of himself around this part of the country got digs from the new Palladium. Could it be, Sayward pondered, that Chauncey was trying to pull such folks down to make himself feel a little better? Resolve's face sobered when he saw the paper in his mother's hands. I'm surprised you read that scurrilous sheet, ma'am, he said. I understand Chauncey writes all the letters to the editor himself. There's one against me and my candidacy most every issue. There was also a very bitter one against you. It didn't give your name, but called you the petticoat plutocrat. I read that one, Sayward admitted calmly. Just what is a plutocrat, Resolve? It's a very rich person who makes everybody dance to his money and influence. Chauncey's against you. In fact, He's against everybody and everything. He's not against the railroad coming in, she defended. No, nor anything else that will save him from the exertion of walking or doing any kind of honest toil, Resolve retorted. Sayward looked mildly grave. Now, that wasn't very partial to facts. You'd still have to walk or drive your horse or ox to the railroad. You could tell Resolve was the lawyer for the canal company. Canal folks claimed the railroad a crack-brained swindle. They said all the land it bought was waste and extravagance, that the low places it filled in and the hills it cut through would stand useless as Indian mounds after the bubble burst. It would be a monument to folly, and anybody who put his money in it deserved to lose it. Sayward hoped for Chauncey's sake it wouldn't work out that way. It would be a shame not to win out after the way he had stuck up for it. Most every time his paper came, it bragged up the railroad. In her mind, she thought of it as Chauncey's railroad, and despite what Resolve said, she put a little secret money into it to help it along. Nothing would have kept her from the celebration that day the railroad's locomotive came. The paper said it had run under its own steam as far west as there were rails to travel on. Then mechanics had taken it apart and shipped the pieces down the Ohio and the canal. When Sayward got downtown, they had already fetched the pieces from the boat to the 4th Street crossing, where they had about put them together. The crowd was so thick she couldn't get nearer than Dr. Keller's drugstore, and he took her upstairs where his family and friends were watching from the windows. She had to admit Resolve nearer right than Chauncey when first she laid eyes on the thing setting down there on the rails, black and besotted, with a vicious iron point in front to cut you to pieces, and a fierce stack belching smoke and fire. It looked like it came from where canal folks claimed, the pits of hell. On the side, in sulphurous letters, was the monster's name, Ch29. A gang of boys carried pails of water from the nearest pumps to fill the greedy belly of the boiler, while men fed stacks of cord wood to the furnace. The first time they blew the whistle, folks started to run in the street. Seeing the steam and hearing the shriek, they reckoned the boiler had exploded. At last, slowly, with more hoots and screechings, and a great hissing and grunting, the engine began to move. Dogs dropped their tails between their legs and ran off howling, while men in front of the engine cleared ditches and fences at a single bound. Old men and women leaned on their staffs and gazed as if doomsday was at hand. Only the young seemed unafraid, running alongside the engine with leaps and capers. The Ch29 moved as far as Buttonwood Street, and came back drawing an open car behind it. Sayward made out Porteous, Resolve, and Dr. Shotwell among the notables on the car. But where was Chauncey? Why wasn't he standing on the first train of his railroad? Dr. Shotwell prayed the Lord to bless this new instrument of man. Resolve was introduced as our next governor, and spoke a few words, but it was Porteous who gave the oration. Standing there on the strange movable platform, he appeared to pay no attention to it or the strange iron contraption in front. Instead, he started telling, quiet as could be, how he had found the woods hereabouts when first he came. You could have heard a pin drop. He went from the woods to the axe and plow, from the cabin to the courthouse and mill, from the Indian trace to the ox and canal. Not till then did he come to the railroad, but he hadn't need to before, because all the while he spoke, the iron dragon stood there in front of everybody's eyes, breathing out smoke and steam. Porteous was getting up in years like she was, but he could still spellbind you. Sayward reckoned she wouldn't easy forget the last few words he spoke. When I look back on the unbroken forest that stood here when first I came, when sight of and communion with another human being was a rare privilege and blessing, when our only light was the fire, the tallow dip, and lard lamp, when the time made on horseback was considered exceedingly fast, and when I stop now and look around me at the growth of civilization, at our countryside flowing with milk and honey, at our cities humming with humanity, and the spinning jenny, and now at the steam locomotive, able to transport people and goods for 100 miles in less than half a day. When I think of all these stupendous and undreamed of changes, all within the span of one short life, speech fails me, and my power of astonishment is almost exhausted. That night, after supper, sitting alone in her kitchen, which she had let dark on purpose, Sayward thought of Jerry lying mouldered away yonder in the old churchyard, and what she would say could she come back and see what Sayward had this day, the fine buildings on the streets, the boats all swarming like fish in the canal, and the shiny new steel road they called the railroad. By Jeem's cousin she could hear her mother say, but what Jerry would be taken with first, Sayward thought, would be her grandchildren she had never seen. Lawsy me, she could hear her mother say, I can't get over our Kinsey a ship captain a-knowin' the 7 seas, but never did I reckon one of my seed would go back on the United American States for old England. Now how is it Libby, a doctor's wife, is blessed with nary chick nor child, while Sooth has so many she don't know what to do with 'em, and Deesia is much too smart, a teachin' school all day and readin' books half the night. She better watch out her head don't bust. And that Massie, how can she stay so lively at her age, with one in the cradle and another on the way? Women in my time used to settle down. Then that little old feller Chauncey writin' pieces for the paper all the way from Cincinnati. But what her mother would come back to again in the end would be the tall 3- and 4-story buildings standing right here where the woods used to be, and now the unbelievable wonders of the railroad. By hokey day, I'm plumb beat out. She could hear her mother sigh. After a while, Sayward rose and walked out in the yard. The sky hung, covered with fine clouds, like small pieces of cotton batting. Down here, on the garden walk, all was still, but up there those clouds ran to the east like sheep over the moon. If you stopped and looked at them a minute, it seemed it was the moon that ran and the clouds that stood still. Now, what was that funny feeling it gave you? All her life she had heard it was not the sun and moon, but the earth that moved, turning like a fat old turkey carcass on the spit. Tonight she could well believe it. Looking at that old moon a-rushing to the westward, she could feel for the first time in her life the old earth rolling to the eastward, turning under her, pushing against her feet and carrying her along. Yes, she knew it now, if she never had before, that the world really moved. Chapter 31, Past and Present. Ah, la, that was a time gone. Lamb in his bosom. If it hadn't been for Miss Ray, Chauncey felt he would never have gone near Resolve's reception. He had no intention to let Resolve think that now he was governor, his youngest brother was running after him and would support him in office. The impressive invitation from the governor's mansion only aroused his criticism. He told Miss Ray that the money for the reception could be better spent giving bread to the poor and education to the unenlightened. But he noticed that Miss Ray's fingers kept tight hold of the card. She was an intelligent woman, with a long, narrow, aristocratic head. An upright collar like a cleric's stood above the dark collar of her dress. Her highly bred face almost never seemed to get its quota of blood and life, yet now a faint warmth and color softened it. "After all, he's your brother, and I think you should go," she said. "There will be very important people there. I only wish we had their names on our subscription list. Your presence won't hurt the cause, or the paper either. Perhaps you would be considerate and let me come along. After all, the governor is your brother, and I could do a little missionary work." Chauncey wished then he had never shown the invitation. He was caught now and would have no other way than go and suffer the torments of the damned, which he did. All the way from Cincinnati to the capital he dreaded the evening at the governor's mansion, and once there among all the blazing candles and whale oil lights, he felt distressed and oppressed. Why, he asked himself, did he always feel like this among the ruling class, especially among strong, successful, self-made people? It was their great power and self-assurance, he told himself, their blind devotion to themselves, to their families, and their particular rounds of duties. Hardly ever could they be instructed or enlightened in their own duties and affairs. The more rugged their struggle with life had been, the more they clung to what they knew and believed. They were sure as eggs of all their old beliefs and resisted like flint any ideas that were new. Most potent, grave, and reverend signors, my noble and approved good masters, he repeated to himself bitterly, quoting a once favorite quotation of his father's. Well, tonight he would try to plow some of these stick in the muds loose from their earthy roots, sow what seed he could on their rocky soil, and let time struggle to bring in a crop of reform. It grew late before he had the chance. Once Miss Ray was welcomed to the big house, she forsook him for an evening of gaiety and social chatter. That was a woman for you, he told himself. Well, he would neither forget nor be bribed. He would give an account of his presence that these infallibles would long remember. Meanwhile, austerely he resisted all advances. Most everyone treated him too cordially to please him. It was for his mother's or his father's sake, he knew, because he was a Wheeler. No one showed fear or consternation as he approached, not even those he had pilloried in the new Palladium. His father greeted him as always. If his stalwart mother felt emotion, she showed none when she hugged him. Not until now that he had been away from her so long did he realize what a creature of past ages she was. A relic of the deep woods, with her heavy skirts, her stout waist, firm mouth, and her severely parted gray hair. Little wonder, he thought, that as a child she never seemed like his parent, and yet on her part she took him around tonight, introducing him as her youngest son and editor of the new Palladium. The way she said it, as if it were the Cincinnati Gazette or Boston Advertiser, made Chauncey wince. All evening the forces of restlessness and rebellion in him gathered. When he blundered into a large back room upstairs, he knew instinctively that this was his Battle of Armageddon. There were only men in that room, swimming in the strong fumes of whiskey and tobacco. His old aversion to both rose to sicken and trouble him, but he dare not back out now. His eyes took in some of the most important men in the state: a lordly white-headed Supreme Court justice, a fierce general with a cane whose only command now was as marshal preserving order at funerals, a famous abolitionist preacher whose red nose said, "Drink," and whose tight mouth said, "Be damned," and a thick, silent man whose name Chauncey recognized as that of the most influential business lord and financial power in the state. There were present also, besides men he did not know, Chauncey's father, Fay's father, a senator from Washington, several congressmen, a pair of leading lawyers, one of whom had thrown a chopping axe across the courthouse roof, the governor, and a tousled ex-governor. Of them all, the senator was the one with whom Chauncey felt most congenial, because of his courageous saying, "If I were a Mexican, as I am an American, I would welcome the American troops to Mexico with bloody hands and to hospitable graves." Schoolboys in Ohio liked to recite that, dyeing their faces and hands with pokeberry juice. "Come in, Chauncey, and join the crowd," his father said, not too enthusiastically. "No, Tom, you'll have to drink that yourself. I'm afraid that Chauncey doesn't indulge." The boy was sensitive that the words belittled him. In the awkward lull that followed, he made his way to a scarlet-covered stool in the corner. He felt he had interrupted something a discussion evidently of extreme importance, probably matters of state, perhaps a national policy. Nothing less could be talked about when such leading and influential men got together. He sat down meekly on his stool, and after a moment or two, the parted atmosphere joined and flowed over him again. "Go on, Judge," resolve prompted. "Well, as I was saying, Governor," the justice resumed, "their father left those boys in the woods all winter, and a mighty severe winter it was too. They lived alone in an open cabin till spring, and, mind you, they were only 9 and 11 years old. All they had to eat were the rabbits they caught in hollow logs, and what was left of a deer after the wolves got through with it. Once in a while they tramped 15 or 20 miles down the Indian Trace to Hiram Sadler's place for a little corn meal. They had no gun, only an axe between them, and yet when their father fetched their mother back in the spring, they had made a considerable clearing." "Oh, that was common, the gray-headed congressman rumbled. "I was brought up in the Firelands. One summer everybody in Clay Sport was down with both ague and fever and bilious fever. Everybody but a boy named Charlie Snyder. He had only the ague and fever. He was considered quite lucky. Every day he tramped 5 miles through the woods for a peck of corn meal. He mashed it first at Judge Hamill's, where he got it, in the judge's hand mill. Then he waited till his second attack of ague came on. After that he fetched the meal to Clay Sport, and we all had rations for another day." Chauncey listened with growing astonishment. Was it possible that these distinguished and influential men had closeted themselves together for nothing more important than the fallacy of the good old days, and how much better they were off then? One of the lawyers stirred. "I've told you this before," he rumbled, "but it may not hurt to tell it again. When I was a boy, my father read to us evenings by the light of pine knots. I had to gather them. Later on, when he found that hickory bark made better light, I had the chore of gathering that too. I can still see him sitting there in the cabin, with the fire blazing and a book in his hands. I'd be hatcheling and carding wool. My mother would be spinning. He'd make us take turns reading sometimes while we chored, but we would all rather work ourselves and hear him. When our books ran out, he bought a share in the library. Nobody had any money. They had to buy things with the skins of game. They called it the Coonskin Library, and I'm sure some of you heard of it. I can name you today every book they had in that library. In my time, we read them all: history, geography, theology, law. In fact, that's where I learned the rudiments of my black stone." "Is that where you learned your law in the Thomas Acton case, John?" The old justice twitted him. "No, Judge," the other came back at him. "If anything ailed my law in the Thomas Acton case, it was all the law books and luxury I've seen since. What gave our generation enterprise and a keen mind was the deprivation we had in the woods, the hard work we enjoyed, and the freedom from deadly refinement and ease. "I can go one better, John," the preacher said. "In fact, I will say, without fear of contradiction, that I am the only one in this room who ever wore a nettle shirt. Some of you must know the old nettle patch. It always grew in the richest ground. Everybody avoided it like the plague. My mother rotted, broke, scratched, and spun it like flax. If you ever walked barefoot, you know how nettles sting, but you should have worn one all winter next to your skin. The holy men of ancient times had their hair shirts to carry them, as they thought, to heaven. Well, I would prescribe nettle shirts to the ease and pleasure-loving youth of today." Chauncey could hold himself back no longer. "That would be unjust," he cried. "Nobody, not even you, Reverend, wore that nettle shirt because it was good for you. You wore it because you were poor and had no wool or flax. But today we are rich and have sheep and woolen mills. To inflict nettle shirts today on the young would be tyranny in its worst form. Saving the soul of our youth would be excuse enough." "Young man," the old abolitionist answered fiercely, "I would try to understand youth before you try to save it," Chauncey replied, trembling, "especially when you commit it to a life of hardship, and to the scourge of civil war on the excuse of freeing slaves." He did not stop there, but launched into an eloquent defense of youth and peace. The words came fast. He wished Miss Ray could be there to take notes, so he might use them in an editorial. And yet, of all the telling things he said, he could remember only the last few sentences. "You gentlemen speak of the past, but the past is dead and gone. Soon you old men who belong to it will be gone, too. Only youth will be left. The old can never understand youth nor the problems of youth. Only youth itself can. Youth is the native of its own times and carries with it the key to its own salvation." Nobody answered when he finished. This time there was a long, grave silence. Then the senator spoke. "It wasn't only the shirts that were strong in those days, Doctor," he said. "It was the pants, too. My mother made me a pair out of the hide of a buck my father shot on the way to Sunday meeting. Whether that made it any better, I don't know, but I couldn't wear those pants out. No brush or thorns could make a dent in them. After they got wet once or twice, you couldn't cut them with a knife. When I'd get through plowing, I'd hold on to the bar and let Buck and Barry drag me down to the barn, hoping to rip those pants to pieces, but nothing fazed them. Well, sir, one time I was plowing in our swamp field. My father talked about draining it, but never got around to it. There was a locust stump in that field he never could get out either. The sprouts came up all around every year like locust does, and the day the thorns gave old Buck a bite. I don't know if Barry felt it too, but he was willing. The minute Buck lit out, Barry did too. I held on to the plow handles. My pants caught on the stump, and when we got to the lower end of the field, I found we had pulled out the stump, dragged it behind us, and dug the prettiest drainage ditch you ever saw clean across that swamp. When he first started telling it, Chauncey thought the senator must be on his side, but he wondered at the laugh that came at the end. He could overlook, he thought, the man who had made the speech against the Mexican War, but he never would forgive the general for his story. Your oxen, Senator, remind me of the sheep that said "Bah" to old Forley. Old Forley came over from the old country. He claimed to escape service in the army. Unless he died lately, he's still living in the Appleton Valley, just outside of Center City. He once knocked a neighbor's calf dead with his fist. When the neighbor took him to court, he claimed the calf kicked him first. When he had a little too much to drink, the boys in Center City used to follow him home calling, "Moo! It kicked me first." He had a favorite sheep, and one time when he came home drunk, he gave the sheep what he gave the calf. It was buying at me like them boys, he told his wife. Chauncey could feel no point to the story, and yet he felt the cold chills go over him as the general gave it. He thought the excessive laughter from the men at this time cruel as their prescription for youth. As the anecdotes went on, one catching fire from another, he could feel that the old-timers were belittling him, putting him in his place, killing his argument with hilarity and savagery. He looked around. Savagery was the word. He saw that unmistakable flame he had noticed before in pioneer eyes, that wild mark of violence and passion that seemed to go hand in hand with their strong comradeship and mutual understanding. Bitterness for their souls possessed him. Here were gathered together some of the master minds of the state, leaders of government, and they degraded themselves in cruel horseplay and blind delusions of the past. When he could, he rose and slipped out. He had the feeling he was neither noticed nor missed. But what was that shout of laughter and extra pitch of exuberance that seemed to follow him down the hall?